Today is Sunday, July 18th, and as I go out for a walk today, I'd like to start something new that I have promised to parents in the past that I would do, and that's to go through the rule of St. Benedict with meditations on how the principles and concepts encountered in the rule of St. Benedict might apply to our family lives. And there's a reason why I think it's beneficial to do this. And that's because the rule of Benedict and the idea of the monastery was itself based on the classical model of the household. If we look back to Greek times, we find the 4th century BC, author Xenophon wrote a book titled On Household Management. It's actually titled Economics in Greek. That would be the best and most literal translation, but to put it into modern context, since economics has a different usage in our generation, even though the word economics in Greek literally means household management, it's better for us to use that phrase to speak of Xenophon's book. But Xenophon explains the philosophical order of the household as it's intended to be ordered and operate based on nature or how God created it. And that model of the household was known throughout classical and medieval times. And when St. Benedict prepared his rule for monastery communities, the monastery was modeled on the classical family or household. And so this meditation is sort of a working backwards, as it were, since the idea of the ancient household has largely been lost. But we have the rule of St. Benedict. We can simply use the rule as a bridge to bring us back to that original rule of the household. Of course, we could also study Xenophon directly, but I don't think that many Catholics will be persuaded that that's worth their time, unfortunately. In fact, I've tried it in the past. So what I'd like to do is, in each of these talks, read a chapter from the rule of St. Benedict and then simply meditate on how that rule might be distilled into principles, and then how those principles might apply and help us in our family life. And I'll do this week by week, one chapter at a time through the rule of St. Benedict. Now, as for the first chapter, in the first chapter, St. Benedict discusses the different kinds of monks. And we should just say something quickly about this word monk before we begin, because I don't know that people really know what the idea of a monk is. In the Ethics, Aristotle explains that there are different circles of ethical concerns. The largest and most significant, which he calls the greatest of all sciences, is politics, or the work of promoting the common good in the community, the broader community. So politics is basically ethics as applied to the community or to the state or to the city. That's politics. The building block of the political society is the household, and the ethics of the household, or the moral law or order of the household, is called domestic ethics. So we have political ethics, then we have domestic ethics, and then the ethical rule of individual men and women is called monastic ethics. Monastic. So this idea of a monastic life or a monastic person is not something that was invented by Christians. It's something that was discussed in the ancient world, and all that it means is individual. The Greek word for one is mono, and so monastic simply means the ethical rule or order for the individual. Political, the Greek word polis means a state or a city. So political means the ethics of the state. Domestic would refer to the household. The Greek word is oikos, which is where we get economics from. It's oiko, and then nomos means law. Oikos and nomos, the law of the household. And then we have monastic, the rule of the individual. The idea of a monk is simply an English word that names a monastic, an individual person seeking to become individually perfect. That's a monk, an individual. And so in this first chapter, St. Benedict discusses 3 different types, or not 3, he just says on the kinds of monks, the different classes of monks. I think he may actually say 4. But the different kinds of monks. And again, remember, our goal in this meditation is to distill or draw out the principles that underlie Benedict's teaching here so that we can apply them to family life. So let's read through chapter 1, and then we'll discuss how what we read might apply to our families. St. Benedict begins, "It is well known that there are 4 kinds of monks." 4 kinds of monks. And we might say, as we study these 4 kinds of monks, that there may be 4 kinds of people. And this may help us think about our families. 4 kinds of monks. The first kind are the Cenobites or Chenobites or Canobites, depending on how you'd like to pronounce that. And these are those who live in monasteries and serve under a rule and an abbot. These would be monks who live in a family-like environment. The second kind of monks are anchorites or hermits. These are those who no longer in the first fervor of their reformation, but after long probation or trial in a monastery, having learned by the help of many brethren how to fight against the devil, go out from the monastery well armed to the solitary combat of the desert. They are able now, with no help save from God, to fight single-handed against the vices of the flesh and their own evil thoughts. That's the second kind of monk, the anchorite or hermit. The third kind of monks are a detestable kind, are the Sarabites. These, notice what he says, not having been tested as gold in the furnace by any rule or by the lessons of experience, are as soft as lead. In their works, they still keep faith with the world, so that their tonsure, which is the haircut that was given to monks, it was a symbol of the crown of thorns. You've probably seen that if you're familiar with any traditional religious orders. Their tonsure marks them as liars before God. They live in twos or threes, small groups, or even singly. There's no community. Without a shepherd, they have no authority. In their own sheepfolds and not in the Lord's. Their law is the desire for self-gratification. Whatever enters their mind or appeals to them, that they call holy. What they dislike, they regard as unlawful. That's the third kind of monks. The fourth kind of monks are those called gyrovagues. Gyrovagues. These spend their whole lives tramping from province to province, staying as guests in different monasteries for 3 or 4 days at a time, always on the move, with no stability. They indulge their own wills and succumb to the allurements of gluttony. And they are in every way worse than the Sarabites. Of the miserable conduct of all such, it is better to be silent than to speak. Passing these over, therefore, let us proceed with God's help to lay down a rule for the strongest kind of monks, the Cenobites. And that's the end of chapter 1. So in this first chapter, we have a discussion of the 4 kinds of monks, the 4 different kinds of individuals who live in different circumstances with different goals, with different principles of life, different dispositions, different ways of life. 4 different kinds of monks. And we could compare this to 4 different kinds of people in secular life. When we look at the quality or the character of the Cenobites, we see individuals who live within the context of an orderly family life. Remember, we're trying to take the principles and apply them to family life. Cenobites are those individuals who live within the order of a family, under the authority of the head of a household. They live in community, and they live according to a rule of life. That rule of life being the rule of the household. By living in community, they're made strong. They're provided for, they're trained, they're instructed, they're surrounded with people with experience, and they're trained for future service. So the Cenobites could be compared to the members of a household. The second kind were the anchorites or hermits. And I think we could compare an anchorite or hermit to an adult child who grows up and receives all of the benefits of the orderly life of the family. And then when he has been trained and proves himself to be responsible and strong and capable of living independently, he leaves the security and protection of the home to go out into the world and fight single-handedly. And what he is able to do as a man is establish his own household and become an abbot, as it were. And he gains that ability, as St. Benedict explains, by having been trained and tested over time within the monastery community or the family in our application. So we can consider the hermit to be an adult son or daughter moving out from the safety of the home to fight single-handedly in the world. The third kind, the Sarabites, are basically like disobedient, independent children who want to leave home but are not trained and are not capable of doing so successfully. They don't want to be part of the family because they don't want to submit to any rule. They're also not going out into the world as hermits because they're not prepared for it, first of all. They're not capable of resisting the evil of it. And in reality, they're actually eager to participate in the worldly culture that is resisted by the well-ordered household, because that's what they actually desire. We read about the Sarabites. These, not having been tested, are soft as lead, easily influenced. They keep faith with the world. If they do bear any marks of the Christian faith, it's become a lie. They live in small groups or singly, and normally when children leave home with no real purpose except that they want to be free, they usually stay with a couple friends or may even go at it alone. They have no shepherd. In their own sheepfolds, in their own groups of people, not in the Lord's, that is, not in the church. Their law is the desire for self-gratification. They don't serve any higher purpose in life other than to do what they think is fun or what pleases them. Whatever enters into their mind or appeals to them, that they call holy or good. And whatever they dislike, they regard as unlawful. So we can imagine this rebellious, individualistic, selfish person who's not interested in the life of the family, not interested in the real independent individual life of the hermit, a good adult life, but they're actually just looking for an excuse to get out of the community and do their own will. They say that the law of the community or the law of the household is unlawful because they don't like it. So they pretend that it violates their rights or somehow denies them the benefits and freedoms that they should be able to enjoy. And I think we can see pretty clearly that this would be an example of, or that this could be applied to the situation where a child leaves home just to be away from home, just to do their own will, rebelling against the rule of the father, and the principles and ends of family life. The fourth kind, the gyrovags, are just those who have this spirit of wanderlust, as it's called. They just love to be all over the place. They're always seeking some adventure. One of the characteristics of this group, it says they are always on the move with no stability. There's no stability of life. They just move from place to place. Always on the move, they indulge their own wills. They succumb to the allurements of gluttony. And they are in every way even worse than the Sarabites. And St. Benedict says it's not even proper to speak of the lives they live. And there we can imagine this sort of traveling, pleasure-seeking individual. And we can imagine, you probably know this dude, we can think of, for example, college students who are just out and about, traveling all over the place. They have no real place to live. They're not committed to any kind of discipline or rule of life. They just live for their own pleasure. In modern circles, they may be those who are into drugs, sort of this hippie culture where you just live in your van, move from place to place, travel from city to city, willing to sleep or stay anywhere you can find a place. We know that kind of culture usually ends badly for them. But we can see in these four kinds of monks, four different kinds of people in the world, and how they relate to family life. The Cenobites are committed members of a family, concerned about the good of the family, those who honor their mother and their father. They love their parents, they love their siblings. They're willing to work and sacrifice for the good of the community, the good of the family. When a son learns the ways of his father, grows up, becomes a mature man himself, and wants to go out into the world and become a father himself, being willing to start his own household and lead this fight single-handedly, he does so, and this is like the hermit. He goes out to seek perfection, normally as an individual, and then eventually becomes the center and head of a community. This is actually how many monastic communities developed in Christian history. Some holy hermit received visitors and became famous, and a community formed around what was a hermit. But at the family level, it's like an adult, responsible son leaving home to go out, establish his own life, and start his own household. And then the third and fourth examples of less than noble individuals who pursue pleasure of some kind in the world, we can see that these four kinds of monks also correspond to, in some way, maybe loosely, to the 3 or 4 kinds of lives that Aristotle describes in the Ethics. The vulgar who seek their own pleasure and live like animals. The political who seek honor. And then the contemplative who seek wisdom. But clearly, St. Benedict says that the Cenobites are the strongest of the 4 kinds of monks. And the ideal is the formation of monastic communities. It seems here like Benedict is saying that it would be better for a holy man to remain in a community and act like a father to the other members of the community rather than going out as a hermit. We could also consider the hermit to be, maybe this is even better as I think about it, maybe the hermit is more like a child who leaves home for the religious life and actually will not form a household of his own. Maybe it would be better to say that an adult child who seeks to establish his own household would be simply part of an extended community, and so would actually remain a Cenobite, whereas the hermit is more like the child who leaves home, who seeks religious life and does not intend to create a family community. So it's an interesting meditation to think about how the different kinds of monks relate to different kinds of people and how they all relate to the household in different ways. The principles, I think you can see. The stability of the community, the order of the community, that there is an abbot or father in the community who rules over that community, to whom all the members of the community are voluntarily subject for the good of all, the common good. We can see the principles that are there. The principles of the life of the hermit who goes out to fight after having been trained and developed with instruction and experience, goes out to fight against the enemy in single-handed combat, in the desert, as it were. And then the 2 inferior kinds of monks, those who seek their own pleasure, who are their own law, and those who live unstable, running from place to place, given to gluttony and pleasure. 4 different kinds of people. And we can see how these, as I said, we can see how these relate to the household. And we can identify these different kinds of people in our families. And then at the end of the chapter, Benedict tells us that the topic of the rule is going to be the life and order of the strongest kind of monks, the Cenobites. And so this would sort of confirm our plan, which is to read through the Rule of St. Benedict and think of how the principles of the rule, which were originally abstracted from classical family life, may be returned to some concrete applications in the consideration of modern family life, that we can reconstruct the principles and practices of family life based on the principles that we will read in the Rule of St. Benedict. So, I think that gives us a lot to think about. We should ask ourselves, as we look at our families and look at the members of our families, I think we should ask, looking at each individual, what kind of person is this? Is this person like a Cenobite, like a hermit, like a Sarabite, or like a gyro-vague? That should help us to understand why they do what they do. It should help us to understand how we should try to direct and influence them what we should encourage and discourage and teach them in their lives. And if Cenobites are in fact the best kind of monk, it seems that we should try to lead individuals into that kind of life according to the principles of the Cenobite monk. So that's a good beginning. I think it provides us with some material to meditate on, and I'm going to leave it off there because what I want is for you to meditate on the principles, to pay attention to the principles, to read through the chapter again and look at the details and draw out the principles. Yes, this is about monks, but in another sense, this is simply a discussion of principles present in different kinds of people, which is why there are different kinds of monks. They're not all equal, they're different. Some are better than others, and we should meditate and think about how this applies to our life as families and individuals. Focus on the principles and then meditate on how they apply. We'll continue this discussion through the Rule of St. Benedict, one chapter at a time, working to make this abstraction of principles and application of those principles to family life. If you have any questions or would like to talk about this, please ask those questions. I think that this discussion and study will lead us into many interesting discussions, many interesting questions that will allow us to approach family life and household management from a unique and yet thoroughly Christian perspective. So please, read the chapter, reflect on the principles, consider the applications, and share your meditations with us. Because we all have different experiences, we all have unique circumstances, and these differences between us are interesting. And they may lead us to understand other principles of life, where we may see that we have different circumstances, but there are some common threads that run through them all, and that will give us wisdom and help us to understand the real principles of family life, to develop something of a science of family life based on the Rule of St. Benedict. So please do share any interesting thoughts you have, any questions that arise, any other thoughts that this meditation leads to, thoughts on things you read in Scripture or principles of moral philosophy, stories to tell in your life that you think shed some light on these things or are made understandable because of this meditation. Let's share those things and discuss these things together and try to understand better how we should live in light of the Rule of St. Benedict. I hope that's a helpful beginning to this meditation, looking at the Rule of St. Benedict from a different perspective, seeking to glean from it practical insights into family life. God bless.